Cognitive psychology looks at how we interpret the world. It focuses on internal processes, meaning what goes on in our bodies and brains. By analysing these, we can begin to understand our behaviour, such as how we remember and view the world. So basically, it's all about how we think. Now, cognitive psychology was developed by psychologists who were dissatisfied with the behaviourist approach. They felt the behaviourist approach couldn't really explain how we perceive things or how we learn a language. Cognitive psychologists draw an analogy between the human brain and a computer. They use computer models to try and explain how we think. This is called cognition. They describe the human brain as a processor of input data. They study our perception, our use of language, our attention, and our memories. Unfortunately, as with everything, there are problems with this approach. It assumes that all humans are rational and logical beings, and as you'll know, most of us aren't. Now, a lot of investigations and studies are carried out in laboratories. This makes it easier to control the variables, but it also means that they lack ecological validity because they're carried out in an artificial setting. Sometimes field experiments are used. These have higher ecological validity and are truer to life. But remember, it's harder to control the variables. Case studies are also used, usually people with brain damage. But it's hard to generalise from just a few case studies to the whole population. One of the main problems is having to take into account the genetic differences between individuals, which makes generalisation difficult. Cognitive psychologists also use brain imaging. They can use PET scans and CT scans to find out which parts of the brain are active when a person is carrying out a task. Now back over to Will in the studio to find out about human memory, whilst I go and find an ice cream.
Quite fancy an ice cream myself. Okay, now we're going to look at human memory and how it can help us to evaluate how reliable eyewitness testimony is in court cases. Now, you'll need to know 4 studies in detail. First, Peterson and Peterson. This is a case study into the nature of short-term memory. Next, Barrick, a study into the nature of long-term memory. Also Bartlett, a study of reconstructive memory. And lastly, Loftus and Palmer, a study into the role of leading questions in eyewitness testimony. Okay, so these are the main ones to learn, but it's a good idea to learn other studies that might support or refute the theories about memory. Only, you don't have to learn these in the same detail. You'll also need to look at models. For human memory, you'll need to know about the multi-store model of memory developed by Atkinson and Schifrin, the working memory model developed by Baddeley and Hitch, and finally, the levels of processing model as described by Craik and Lockhart. But hang on, it doesn't stop there. You'll also need to know about encoding, capacity and duration, concentrating on the ways in which these are different in short and long-term memories. Also, some of the explanations about forgetting in short-term memory, such as decay and displacement, and explanations for forgetting in long-term memory, for example, retrieval failure and interference. Lastly, it's essential we appreciate the role of emotional factors in memory and be aware of the phenomenon known as flashbulb memory and of Freud's theory of repression. Right, over to Zara then, and her explanation of how memory works.
Memory involves retaining information from the past and being able to access that information. In 1953, a patient in his 20s suffering from severe epilepsy had surgery that removed large areas of both sides of his brain. Okay, so he no longer had epileptic fits, but he could no longer remember anything that had happened to him. Strangely, he could still learn to carry out tasks, but afterwards he couldn't remember doing the tasks. he couldn't form any new memories and couldn't remember anything that had happened to him in the 2 years before the operation. What was really weird was that he could remember events that had happened to him before those 2 years. This showed that the areas that had been removed from his brain were involved in storing memories less than 2 years old. It demonstrated that memory is not just a simple store of data. We can divide our conscious memory of facts and experiences into two. Firstly, short-term memory. This needs active concentration and attention. We use this when we're trying to remember something like a phone number. Secondly, long-term memory. This is the ability to recall information and experiences from our past. Some of this memory is episodic. That is, recalling particular episodes and the time that they took place, such as parties. And factual, such as meanings of words, people's names, and so on. I'm sure you can think of a few. Most psychologists agree that there are 3 types of memory. Sensory memory, where visual and auditory information pass quickly through sensory areas of the brain, leaving a trace that fades quickly by spontaneous decay. This is difficult to study as it is so transient. Next, short-term memory. This has limited capacity and limited duration, so we remember small amounts of information for short periods of time. Lastly, long-term memory. Long-term memory, LTM, has, theoretically, unlimited capacity and duration. It's permanent. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at short-term memory with Jess. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Zara. That makes everything so much clearer. Right. In 1959, Peterson and Peterson investigated the duration of short-term memory. They reached some interesting conclusions. But before we look at their findings, we're going to try a little experiment of our own using you. Yes, I did say you. Try being a subject in this experiment. Pause for a moment and go and get yourself a pencil and paper. I'm going to read you some nonsense trigrams, random 3-letter consonants, and then ask you to recall them. Here goes. I'll read them out and then pause. After 3 seconds, you write them down. CVM, BDM, DLC. How did you get on? Here they are again for you to check yours against ours. Now I'll read out 3 more. This time, pause and wait for 12 seconds before you write them down. TLC, PYT, KGY. Pause for 12 seconds and write them down. How did you get on? In the actual experiment, the participants had to recall and write down groups of nonsense trigrams after A, 3 seconds, B, 6 seconds, C, 12 seconds, and D, 18 seconds. They then repeated the tasks using different trigrams, but had to count backwards in between seeing the trigrams and recalling them. This is called an interference task. They found that more trigrams were remembered correctly when the time between seeing them and recalling them was shorter. Fewer were remembered correctly when an interference task was introduced, because it prevented rehearsal of the information. It was concluded that without rehearsal, very little stays in the short-term memory for more than 18 seconds. This study lacks ecological validity, as it's artificial and the trigrams have no meaning, therefore no significance to the subjects. We can usually remember things a lot better when what we're trying to remember means something or is important to us. That's why we sometimes use memory aids to remember a string of facts that might not be particularly interesting to us. We make up a sentence that does mean something to us, using the first letters of the list of facts we need to remember. For example, The sentence, "My very energetic mother jogs Saturday under no pressure," helps me remember the order of the planets in the solar system. In 1887, Jacobs studied the capacity of the short-term memory and found that most people can remember a sequence of 9 numbers or 7 words. In 1956, Muller found that most people remember about 7 items from a list. Let's give you a challenge and see what you can remember. Pause for a moment and grab your pencil and paper again. Now listen carefully. I'm going to read a list of 10 words to you. Write down as many as you can remember when I tell you to. But just listen first and don't cheat. Here goes. Cat, motorbike, table, trampoline, barbecue, doll, hedge, pigeon, marble, and telephone. Now pause for 10 seconds and then write down the words you can remember. Okay, let's see how you've done. Take a minute and check your list against this one. Interestingly enough, most people remember the words read at the beginning of the text. Right, we'll try something different now. Look at this list of numbers. Study them, then when they've disappeared, write them down in the correct order. 1, 4, 9, 1, 6, 2, 5, 3, 6, 4, 9, 6, 4, 8, 1. How did you get on? Here they are again for you to check yours against ours. You might have found it easier if you've broken the information into chunks and looked for a pattern, a bit like this. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81. So the question is, how well do we remember? Let's see if Zara knows the answer.
Well, I'll try to answer that for you, Jess. Here goes. In 1975, Barrick studied how effective our very long-term memories are. He asked 392 people who had all gone to the same high school in America to identify their ex-classmates. Some of the participants were shown photos of their ex-classmates and asked to name them without a list of names to refer to. This is called a photo recognition test. The others were given the names and asked to match the names to the photos. This is called a name recognition test. The findings were very interesting. Let's start with the participants who were shown photos. What they found was that within 15 years of leaving school, the participants could identify 90% of names and faces. Memory was seen to fade the longer the time between school and leaving. Even after 47 years, the participants were 60% accurate on free recall. After 48 years, recognition was still good at about 75%, but free recall accuracy had dropped to only 30%. The study clearly demonstrated how effective long-term memories are in a real-life setting. The recognition tests assisted greatly with accuracy, which showed that the information was stored in people's brains, but that it was not always easy to access. This study has ecological validity, but it was hard to control all the variables. It doesn't tell us how or where the information is stored in the brain or how it's accessed. It doesn't really tell us anything about the physical nature of memory. Psychologists have developed models to try to explain some aspects of how memory works. The problem is they're too simplistic and they don't really offer any explanations as to what's happening in the brain. Psychologists also work with neurologists, and research is shedding some light on which parts of the brain are involved with certain types of memory. Let's look first at the multi-store model of memory, and then we'll look at a couple of alternatives. The multi-store model of memory was developed by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968. This model suggests that there are three memory stores: a sensory store, a short-term store, and a long-term store. The sensory store receives sensory input that forms a trace, much of which decays quickly. Some of this input you pay attention to and think about it so that it moves into the short-term memory. If the sensory input is rehearsed, then the remembering becomes more effective and the information moves into the long-term memory. There is support for the multi-store model, the primacy and recency effect you learned about earlier when recalling items from our list. The earlier items have been rehearsed and therefore are in your long-term memory. The later items are still in your short-term memory but have not yet decayed. Will!
Zara, hi! How are you? Mwah. Mwah.
I'm really well, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. What are you doing here?
Well, I was going to go for a drink. What are you doing?
Just in town, really.
Well, do you want to join me?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay,
I'd love
come
to. Can I have a pint of
No,
Stella?
he won't. He's underage. He'll have a Coke.
Fine.
And I'll have a vodka and orange, please.
Here.
That was close, Will, wasn't it?
Yeah, thanks for that, Zara.
That's all right, no problem.
Appreciate that. Nice to see you.
Best not to jeopardise the licence of the pub, really.
Yeah, it's best not to. Best not to.
Relax, anyway. Alcohol's not really that good for you.
No, I know. Been doing about it in psychology, actually.
Oh, have you? Thank you.
That was good.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's all right, Will. I'll get
Okay, you
them.
do whatever you do. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Zara.
There's your Coke.
Okay, I'm all done. Okay,
Just go away.
right, okay.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Let's sit over here. Can't beat a good vodka and orange.
I bet you can't.
Something wrong, Will?
Do you know about Korsakoff syndrome? It's a type of amnesia that's caused by damage to the brain due to excessive or long-term alcohol consumption. A bit like what you're doing now, actually. People with this disorder, they have an unimpaired recency effect and have a poor long-term memory. Just shows the difference, really, between long and short-term memories. Enjoying that, are you?
Oh, Will. Of course I've heard of Korsakoff syndrome. As you said, it's excessive drinking. This is just a vodka and orange. Look, Korsakoff syndrome is when there's damage to an area of the brain called the basal forebrain. Look, this part of the brain produces a chemical that makes the hippocampus and the thalamus more alert and receptive to information. I know that Alzheimer's disease, new variant CJD, Down syndrome and repeated blows to the head all can damage that part of the brain.
You are such a know-it-all.
Yeah.
I bet you didn't know there are other types of amnesia. For example, retrograde amnesia, where people can't remember anything that happened to them before the event that caused the amnesia, but they can remember things after the event. And anti-retrograde amnesia, where people can't form new memories. but they can remember things that happened to them before the accident. Elderly people.
Oh.
Elderly people have very poor short-term memories, but they can recall events in their past. Kind of shows the difference between long and short-term memories.
Yeah, that's good, but do you know about the weakness of the multi-store model? No, I thought not. Look, the big weakness with the multi-store model is that a lot of the information that passes into our long-term memories isn't actively rehearsed. Also, you need to consider other factors when you're looking at memory, such as emotions and state of mind. These can influence whether or not a memory is stored. Anyway, the multi-store model is oversimplified. It doesn't tell us anything about the nature of memory, how or where in the brain memories are stored. Oh, anyway, Will, I've got to go. I'm meeting my boyfriend outside the old mill in 20 minutes. Listen, it was good to see you. Yeah?
Yeah, great.
I'll see you soon. Take care.
See ya. Well, that was a bit disappointing. Got turned down for a pint, and then got blown out by Zara. Well, I guess we better go back over to Jess. I wonder if she's going out with anyone.
Right, well, thanks for that introduction, Will. So, as he was supposed to say, we're going to talk about neuroscience studies and studies about brain-damaged patients. These tell us that lots of parts of the brain are involved in memory. For example, the hippocampus holds memories of events, and the temporal cortex holds memories of facts. The thalamus and medial temporal lobe are also involved in memory. The medial temporal lobe is generally associated with encoding, storage, and the retrieval of long-term memories. The basal forebrain is believed to play an important role in episodic memory recall, but the basal forebrain can be damaged by lots of different things, including alcohol, leading to memory impairment. Let's look at the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is involved with the working memory, or memory which is needed for an immediate task, and the episodic memory, memories associated with events. The hippocampus enables us to navigate and have a sense of direction. For example, London cabbies use this part of the brain. It shows on a scan as they imagine driving around London. Animals that forage and store food for the winter have large hippocampuses, as do elephants, who have to remember where water is. So it's true, elephants never forget. In 1974, Baddeley and Hitch developed an alternative multi-store model of the short-term memory, called the working memory model. The working memory is split into three parts. Firstly, the central executive. This plays an important role in attention and planning. It's got limited capacity and controls two slave systems that also have limited capacity. Next, the visual sketchpad. One of the slave systems is called the visual sketchpad and can be thought of as the inner eye. It's a short-term store for visual and spatial information. Lastly, the phonological loop. The other slave system is called the phonological loop and holds speech-based information. It contains a phonological store, or inner ear, and an articulatory process, or the voice. Support for the model is said to be provided by studies using interference tasks. Because participants can't perform two tasks at once, the explanation given is that both tasks use the phonological loop, and this has limited capacity and so can't cope with both tasks at once. A case study of a brain-damaged patient with an impaired short-term memory showed that he could recall images he'd recently seen, but could not recall words he'd just seen. He was described as having a damaged articulatory loop. There are criticisms of this model. It doesn't really explain anything. There are no actual areas of the brain called central executive or phonological loop, but there are lots of areas of the brain involved with memory. Neurological studies show that the hippocampus may be involved with storing long-term memory information, for up to 2 years. The information is then somehow transferred to the temporal cortex for the permanent storage. Studies also show that we have different areas of the brain involved with face recognition, language, numbers, or with objects and their use. As mentioned before, we have one area of the brain totally devoted to navigation. Some people have one area impaired and so may remember events, faces, names, and at the same time not be able to memorise words and their spellings. In 1972, Craik and Lockhart developed another alternative model of memory called the Levels of Processing model. This focuses on the processing of incoming information. They described 3 levels of processing in this way. First, physical processing. This occurs at a simple, superficial level. It analyses information in terms of its physical qualities, such as the colour of the ink used for a word. Next type, phonemic processing. It occurs at a more complex or deeper level and focuses on the sound of the word. For example, B rhymes with C. Lastly, semantic processing. This is at the deepest level. It analyses the meanings of the word. For example, bee is an insect that can sting and make honey. This model suggests that the deeper the level of processing of information, the better the recall. We use this idea in teaching. Giving students learning activities makes the learning active rather than passive. Students have to process information and this helps store it permanently in their long-term memories. But this model ignores the distinction between short and long-term memories, and it may be confusing effort of processing information with depth. Have you noticed that information presented with a diagram is often easier to learn than just a lot of writing? If the diagram is on the left side of the page and the writing on the right side, most of the information from the diagram goes to the right side of the brain, and the information from the writing goes to the left side of the brain. This means that the written words are going to the side of the brain that is concerned with language. The diagrammatic information goes to the side of the brain that deals with the pictures. So, you are processing the information using both sides of the brain. The important thing is that processing information does help you learn. You take in very little by just listening. You need to discuss, think, answer questions, make notes, draw flow diagrams, make posters, role play, research information, debate, carry out investigations, watch videos and DVDs. You need to be an active participant in the process.